Greetings to you and thank you for tuning in. This is a quick video to show you some of the things that are being said by experts around the world. There's going to be doctors, scientists, law professors, and so forth that will appear in this video from different countries, and they will give you their assessment of what they believe is now occurring. A research company in Switzerland has compiled facts about COVID-19. They have it available in 12 or 13 different languages. I'm attaching the link inside the comment section so that you can look at this report yourself. It has all of the links associated with this research for you to go ahead and click on and take a look at yourself. Okay, so this is the big source because it contains many sources in it from various different countries throughout the world. These evidence-based analysis will hopefully give you some perspective on what's really occurring right now and help you to make decisions regarding your own families. So let's begin in Italy because we know that Italy has been very hard hit by this. It's important to note that northern Italy has one of the oldest populations and the worst air quality in Europe, and that has already caused an increased number of respiratory diseases and deaths. And they're saying it's an additional risk factor in this current epidemic. This is a satellite image that shows how northern Italy has the highest level of air pollution in Europe. A leading Italian doctor reports that strange cases of pneumonia were seen in the Lombardy region already in November 2019, which raised again the question if they were caused by the new virus, which was officially appeared in Italy February 2020, or by other factors such as the dangerously high smog levels in northern Italy. Another interesting and important factor to consider was brought forth on March 19th of 2020, a report in the Italian newspaper Corriere della Sera, and they pointed out that Italian intensive care units already collapsed under the marked flu wave from 2017-2018, and they had to postpone operations, call nurses back from holiday, and they ran out of blood donations. So these issues in the hospitals have been occurring since before the COVID-19 virus. An Italian study published August of 2019 found that flu deaths in Italy were between 7,000 and 25,000 in recent years. This value is higher than in most other European countries due to the large elderly population in Italy, and it's much higher than anything attributed to COVID-19 so far. So according to the latest data of the Italian National Health Institute, the average age of the positively tested deceased in Italy is currently about 81 years old. 10% of the deceased are over 90 years old, and 90% of the deceased are over 70 years old. This graph demonstrates the number of diseases that the deceased people suffered from. The light blue being no other diseases, the slate color being one other disease, the green 2 other diseases, and the orange 3+. Nearly 80% of their deceased had suffered from 2 or more chronic diseases. 50% of the deceased had suffered from 3 or more chronic diseases. And the chronic diseases included in particular cardiovascular problems, diabetes, respiratory problems, and cancer. Less than 1% of the deceased were healthy persons, such as persons without any pre-existing chronic diseases, and only about 30% of the deceased are women. On March 17th, Italian immunologist and professor Sergio Romagnani from the University of Florence came to the conclusion in a study on 3,000 people that 50 to 75% of the test-positive people of all ages remain completely symptom-free, and that's significantly more than previously assumed. South Korea, for instance, has experienced a much milder course than Italy and has already passed the peak of the epidemic. In South Korea, only about 70 deaths with a positive test result have been reported so far. Regarding the situation in Italy, most major media falsely report that Italy has up to 800 deaths per day from the coronavirus. In reality, The president of the Italian Civil Protection Service stresses that these are deaths with the coronavirus and not from the coronavirus. So let's watch that clip.
Purtroppo oggi registriamo 627 nuovi deceduti e voglio ricordare che questi sono deceduti con il coronavirus, non per il coronavirus, perché come sapete l'Istituto Superiore della Sanità sta portando avanti un'indagine epidemiologica e quindi sarà l'Istituto Superiore della Sanità a comunicarci questi dati.
In other words, these persons died while also testing positive. Current test-positive death figures in Italy are still less than 50% of normal daily overall mortality in Italy, which is around 1,800 deaths per day. Thus, it is possible, perhaps even likely, that a large part of normal daily mortality now simply counts as COVID-19 deaths as they test positive. This is the point stressed by the president of the Italian Civil Protection Service. The few dozen test-positive Swiss deaths so far were also high-risk patients with chronic diseases, an average age of more than 80 years and a maximum age of 97 years, whose exact cause of death from the virus or pre-existing diseases is not yet known. The renowned Italian virologist Giulio Taro argued that the mortality rate of COVID-19 is below 1% even in Italy, and it's therefore comparable to influenza. The higher values only arise because no distinction is made between deaths with and by COVID-19, and because the number of symptom-free infected persons is greatly underestimated. An extensive survey in Iceland found that 50% of all test-positive persons showed no symptoms at all, while the other 50% mostly showed really moderate cold-like symptoms. According to the Icelandic data, the mortality rate of COVID-19 is in the per mille range, i.e. in the flu range or below. The German Network for Evidence-Based Medicine criticized the media reporting on COVID-19. They state, "The media coverage does not in any way take into account the criteria of evidence-based risk communication that we have demanded. The presentation of raw data without reference to other causes of death leads to an overestimation of the risk." A manufacturer of the COVID-19 test kits states that it should only be used for research purposes and not for diagnostic applications, as it's not yet been clinically validated. Furthermore, studies are showing that the internationally used virus test kits may give a false positive result in some cases. In these cases, the persons may not have contacted the new coronavirus, but presumably one of the many existing human coronaviruses that are part of the annual and currently ongoing common cold and flu epidemics. In Switzerland, some emergency departments are already overloaded simply from people who want to be tested. This is actually an additional psychological and logistical component of the current situation. A preliminary study by researchers at Stanford University showed that 20 to 25% of COVID-19 positive patients tested additionally positive for other influenza or cold viruses. Two Stanford professors of medicine, Dr. Aaron Ben-David and Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, explain in an article that the lethality of COVID-19 is overestimated by several orders of magnitude and is probably even in Italy only at 0.01% to 0.06%, and thus below that of influenza. The reason for this overestimation is the greatly underestimated number of people already infected that are without symptoms. As an example, the fully tested Italian community of Vo is mentioned, which showed 50 to 75% symptom-free test-positive persons.
In this strange time when so many of us are shut up in our homes, suppose you had the opportunity to ask somebody questions who knew exactly what was happening outside. Suppose he was an MD who understood the coronavirus in detail, and that he held a doctorate in economics that enabled him to understand the economic implications of the virus. That describes my own position right now. I'm about to speak with Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, professor of medicine, and my friend right here at Stanford. Jay, thanks for making the time to join us.
My pleasure, Peter.
This is a special plague time edition of Uncommon Knowledge with Peter Robinson. I'm Peter Robinson. Jay's in his office because he's considered an essential worker. I'm at home because whatever else I am, I'm not essential. And so we're recording this thing online. Jay, here's the first question. How bad is it? You published a piece in the Wall Street Journal this past Tuesday, March 24th. We're recording this on Friday. Quote, if it's true that the coronavirus would kill millions without shelter-in-place orders and quarantines, then the extraordinary measures are surely justified. But there's little evidence to confirm that premise. Explain that.
Yeah, so I think the key thing to know about the virus and how much we know about it is that we actually don't know how many people have been infected. It's a very strange thing to say, given how much data is floating around. But it sounds like it's a remarkable thing, but it's actually just a plain scientific fact. And that has to do with the fact that the testing for the virus has focused on people who actively have the virus. The tests have been used everywhere. That's what it does. It looks and sees if the RNA for the virus is in you. And if it's in you, then it's positive. If it's not in you, it's negative. And then that's that, right? But this is not like HIV, where if you get the virus, you have it for life. Most people, there's a range of presentations. You get the virus, you get some symptoms, and then you're better, and the virus is gone. And the test would be negative for someone like that. But there's increasing evidence that someone like that would probably be immune to being reinfected.
So when we talk about not the fatality rate, what is it called? The rate of lethality?
Yeah,
that's a ratio. It's a mathematical ratio in which the numerator is, very sadly, the number of people who die.
Right.
And the denominator is those who have been tested, right?
So that's the measured case fatality rate.
All right, the measured case fatality rate.
And the problem is that denominator does not count the people who got infected and were recovered.
All right. Two quotations, Jay. Here's Dr. Anthony Fauci. We all know he's as famous as the president right now. He's the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. And here he is in early March, just a couple of weeks ago. Quote, the flu has a mortality rate of 0.1%, 0.1%. This, meaning the coronavirus, has a mortality rate of 10 times that, close quote. Here's Dr. Jay Bhattacharya in his piece in the Wall Street Journal. Again, this is March 24th, just a couple of days ago. Quote, and you're talking about when you think the virus was first seeded in this country. Quote, an epidemic seed on January 1st implies that by March 9th, about 6 million people in the US would have been infected. As of March 23rd, it's that Monday of this week, there were 499 COVID-19 deaths in the US. That's a mortality rate of 0.01%. In other words, a whole order of magnitude less than Dr. Fauci claimed just a couple of weeks earlier.
I mean, I think the thing is, nobody knows the number. The numbers we've seen are consistent with a very, very wide range, from an epidemic that will kill 2 to 4 million people on one end, and an epidemic that will kill 50,000 to 100,000 people on the other. That's an incredibly broad range, and the policies you do to avoid 2 to 4 million deaths are very, very different than the policies you do to avoid, 50,000 to 100,000 deaths.
In an article published in the European Journal of Clinical Investigation, Stanford professor of medicine John C. Ioannidis criticized the harms of exaggerated information and non-evidence-based measures. He asserts that the new coronavirus may be no more dangerous than some of the common coronaviruses, even in older people. He argues that there is no reliable medical data backing the measures currently decided upon. It's important to note that countries like South Korea and Japan that introduced no lockdown measures have experienced near zero excess mortality in connection with COVID-19, while the Diamond Princess cruise ship experienced an extrapolated mortality figure in the per mille range. Using data from the cruise ship, he showed that the age-corrected lethality of COVID-19 is between 0.025% and 0.625, which means at or below the level of the seasonal flu. Ioannidis did a 1-hour in-depth interview on the lack of data for COVID-19 measures. Here is a clip of it.
So, Professor, if you could just begin by telling us your name and a little bit about your background.
I'm John Ioannidis. I'm a professor of medicine and of epidemiology and population health at Stanford University. I'm one of the two co-directors of the Meta Research Innovation Center at Stanford, or METRICS. My research is interested in appraising evidence, in trying to understand data, strengths of data and weaknesses of data, and trying to make sure that we have the most useful information to make decisions that matter.
You recently wrote an article that caused a lot of discussion. Could you tell us why you wrote it?
So this article was trying to appraise the current situation regarding COVID-19. COVID-19 is clearly the major challenge that we're facing as a country, as the whole world actually. It is a major threat. We need to act with alacrity, and we need to act having the best data. We need to act having reliable data. Unfortunately, much of the information that we have collected so far, and this is not to blame anyone, it's just something that has arisen very fast and has caught us off guard in a way. It's a new pandemic. Most of that information is not reliable. We have increasing evidence that many of the key features that pertain to what this pandemic is about, how lethal is that virus, how many people it has infected or will infect, what is likely to be the eventual impact, and how effective are the different measures that we're applying. We have major gaps in practically all of those fronts. So it is imperative that we try to cover this lack of unbiased evidence as quickly as possible.
Danish researcher Peter Guttgen, founder of the renowned Cochrane Medical Collaboration, writes that corona is an epidemic of mass panic and that logic was one of the first victims. The Milan microbiologist Maria Rita Gismondo called on the Italian government to stop communicating the daily number of corona positives, as these figures are fake, and put the population in unnecessary panic. She added, the number of test positives depends very much on the type and number of tests, and says nothing about the state of health. The ARTE documentary Profiteers of Fear from 2009 showed us how the mainly privately financed World Health Organization upgraded a mild wave of influenza, the so-called swine flu, to a global pandemic so that vaccines worth several $1 billion could be sold to governments around the world. Some of the protagonists of that time are again prominently represented in the current situation. German immunologist and toxicologist Professor Stefan Hockertz explains in a radio interview that COVID-19 is no more dangerous than influenza, the flu, but that it's simply observed much more closely. More dangerous than the virus is the fear and panic created by the media and the authoritarian reaction of many governments. Professor Ockerts also notes that most so-called corona deaths have in fact died of other causes while also testing positive for coronaviruses. Ockerts believes that up to 10 times more people than reported have already had COVID-19, but noticed nothing or very little. According to press reports in Switzerland, oxygen bottles may become scarce. The reason is not currently a higher usage, but rather hoarding due to fear of future shortages. Former Israeli Health Minister, Professor Yoram Lass, says that the new coronavirus is less dangerous than the flu, and that lockdown measures will kill more people than the virus. He adds that the numbers do not match the panic, and psychology is prevailing over science. The president of the German Robert Koch Institute confirmed again that pre-existing conditions and actual cause of death do not play a role in the definition of the so-called corona deaths. From a medical point of view, such definition is clearly misleading. It has the obvious and generally known effect of putting politics and society in fear. The director of the University Medical Center Hamburg, Dr. Ansgar Losch, demands a quick end to curfews and contact bans. He argues that more people should be infected with corona. Kitas and schools should be reopened as soon as possible so that children and their parents can become immune through infection with the coronavirus. The continuation of the strict measures would lead to an economic crisis, which would also cost lives, said the physician. The Argentinian virologist Pablo Goldschmidt, who lives in France, considers the political reaction to COVID-19 as completely exaggerated, and he warns against totalitarian measures. In parts of France, the movement of people is already monitored by drones. Goldschmidt adds that measures imposed are medically counterproductive, and he notes that one must now read Hannah Arendt to understand the origins of totalitarianism. German constitutional law experts are raising the alarm for serious encroachment on fundamental rights. Constitutional law expert Hans-Michael Hennig warns that the democratic constitutional state could turn into a fascist hysterical hygiene state in no time. Professor Christoph Mullers of Berlin's Humboldt University explains, the infection protection law cannot serve as a basis for such far-reaching restrictions of citizens' rights of freedom. According to the former president of the German Federal Constitutional Court, Hans-Jürgen Papier, emergency measures do not justify the suspension of civil liberties in favor of an authoritarian and surveillance state. Online petitions have been launched in several countries to end curfews and other encroachments on basic rights. At the same time, critical video contributions, even by doctors, are increasingly being deleted. In Berlin, a registered event on fundamental rights, at which the German Constitution was distributed, was terminated by the police. NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden warns that governments are using the current situation to expand the surveillance state and restrict fundamental rights. The control measures currently put in place would not be dismantled after the crisis. British journalist Peter Hitchens writes, "There's powerful evidence this great panic is foolish, yet our freedom is still broken and our economy crippled." Hitchens points out that in parts of the UK, police drones monitor and report non-essential walks in nature. In some cases, police drones are calling on people via loudspeaker to go home in order to quote-unquote save lives. In an interview on the Brennan O'Neill Show, Hitchens stated, "We've demonstrated that we don't really have a civil society anymore. What shocked me is that the population accepts what they're being told without question." I also shared a quote from Lord Sumptions, a former United Kingdom Supreme Court Justice.
Here from Jonathan Sumption's interview in The World at One on Monday. key part was this. The real question is this serious enough to warrant putting most of our population into house imprisonment, wrecking our economy for an indefinite period, destroying businesses that honest and hard-working people have taken years to build up, saddling future generations with debt, depression, stress, heart attacks, suicides, and unbelievable distress inflicted on millions of people who are not especially vulnerable and will suffer only mild symptoms or none at all.
The German historian René Schlott writes about the rendezvous with the police state. He says, buying a book, sitting on a park bench, meeting up with friends, that is now forbidden, is controlled and denounced. The democratic safeguards seem to be blown. Where and how will it end?
Ich glaube, was jetzt sozusagen den öffentlichen Diskurs beherrscht, ist eine Angst. Das ist die Angst vor einem unbekannten Virus, das wir nicht kennen, das man nicht sehen kann, das aber trotzdem immer wieder uns medial vorgeführt wird, und zwar mit Hilfe von Zahlen. Es gibt in unserer Gesellschaft eine hohe Zahlengläubigkeit. Jede Zahl hat einen hohen Nachrichtenwert, vor allem die schlimmen Zahlen haben einen hohen Nachrichtenwert. Wir erfahren ja kaum was über die Zahl der Heilungen oder der nicht auf Intensivstationen liegenden Patienten von Corona. Das heißt, hier wird auch sozusagen ein medialer Überbietungswettbewerb eigentlich angeheizt, der natürlich die Menschen, die sich jetzt den Medienkonsum aussetzen, dann auch Angst macht. Das kann ich durchaus nachvollziehen. Und diese Angst ruft tatsächlich eben den Ruf nach autoritären Strukturen hervor. Das sieht man, also das ist etwas, was sozusagen immer unter der Gesellschaft liegt. Man muss diese autoritären Strukturen natürlich im Zaum halten, aber gerade so eine Krise, die lässt die Rufe nach dem starken Mann, nach der starken Frau an der Spitze mit der einfachen Lösung wieder lauter werden, und das zeigt sich jetzt ganz deutlich. Das hätte ich nie für möglich gehalten, dass das tatsächlich, also wenn ich eine Umfrage lese, dass 80% noch vor der Verkündung von Ausgangssperren diese Ausgangssperren fordern, freiwillig fordern, das hätte ich nicht für möglich gehalten, dass die demokratischen Mechanismen so stark außer Kraft gesetzt werden können in so kurzer Zeit. In diesem Augenblick müssen wir genauso wie in allen anderen Ausnahmezuständen in einem demokratischen Gemeinwesen darüber nachdenken, gibt es Alternativen, und wir müssen auch kritisch hinterfragen, haben die Politiker tatsächlich die Lage im Griff? Müssten die nicht auch auf Soziologen, Psychologen hören? Sie hören im Moment nur auf Virologen. Das heißt, müssen nicht mehrere gesellschaftliche Interessengruppen in die Entscheidungsfindung einbezogen werden? Ich glaube ja, das gibt irgendwann ein böses Erwachen, wo man dann auf diese Sache zurückblickt und sagt, wie konnten wir denn eigentlich das zulassen, in so kurzer Zeit wirklich fundamentale Grundrechte eingeschränkt werden. Und zwar fundamentale Grundrechte am Anfang halt, ohne dass es eine Befristung gab dafür. Und wenn ich durch Berlin gehe und Spielplätze sehe, auf denen Flatterband mit Polizeibesperrung weht, als wären das Tatorte, als wären das kriminelle Schwerpunkte, dann glaube ich, muss sich unsere Gesellschaft vor ganz, ganz kritischen Fragen stellen, ob man tatsächlich spielende Kinder inzwischen als Gefahr sieht. Das Asylrecht ist faktisch außer Kraft gesetzt. Das, was Angela Merkel 2015 noch zu Recht gemacht hat, nämlich die Grenze offen gehalten aus humanitären Gründen, wurde jetzt handstreichartig an einem Sonntagnachmittag für obsolet erklärt. Das heißt, wir schließen die Schwächsten eigentlich aus unserer Gesellschaft aus, die überhaupt keine Gesundheitsversorgung haben. Wir sagen jetzt, okay, die Solidarität endet wieder an den deutschen Grenzen. Und das ist doch eine Entwicklung, die alle alarmiert machen müsste. Und ich muss Ihnen ganz ehrlich sagen, dass ich jetzt als mutig gelte, das ist doch schon ein Armutszeugnis für unsere Gesellschaft. Mutig ist man jetzt, wenn man einfach von seinen Grundrechten Gebrauch macht und von dem Mainstream von dem Mainstream abweichende Meinung hat. Ich bin überhaupt nicht mutig, weil ich ja nichts riskiere mit dem, dass ich meine Meinung sage. Ich habe weder eine finanzielle Einbuße noch irgendeinen anderen Nachteil entsteht mir daraus. Und das sind doch wirklich Zeiten, wo man nochmal nachdenken muss. Mutig, das muss doch eine Selbstverständlichkeit sein, dass man diese Sachen aussprechen kann, dass man auch Sachen kritisch hinterfragen kann. Und das wird dann immer reduziert darauf, Tod oder Freiheit. Aber wer so eine Gleichung aufstellt, der hat, glaube ich, unsere offene Gesellschaft nicht verstanden.
What we are currently experiencing in a vast majority of countries across the globe in response to COVID is medical martial law. Whether you like that term or not, that's what we're experiencing. The lockdown measures that are being implemented have serious implications for constitutional democracies. It was actually very hard to make this video only a half hour long because there are so many amazing and important things to read on this website. So my next action, I would urge you to visit the website, check on the links, spend some time researching this so that you can make a determination for yourself where you stand on what's really going on.